In 1952, American composer and artist John Cage premiered a work that challenged the notion of what music is and the social activity of listening to music. For many, it's introduced as the answer to a trivia question. For a musician, we learn about it when we study 20th century music and the postmodern movement. This is 4 minutes and 33 seconds, a piece composed for any combination of instruments. When David Tudor gave the premiere performance in 1952, he signaled the beginning of each of the three movements by closing the lid of the piano, and ended each movement by opening it again. During each movement, Tudor simply sat, observing the marked time of each movement. In between movements, Tudor observed the customary relaxed quietude of preparation common to any classical performance. For those who might not be familiar with sheet music or notation, there are no notes on this page, not any. Instead, we see tacit. Tacit comes from the Latin tacere, meaning literally it is silent, and musicians use it to mean don't play. While a violinist or horn player might see this only once in a while, it's a fairly common term for, say, the triangle player, who may only play during one movement of a symphony. Performance organizations like music collectives and symphonic orchestras promote experimentation, which allows them to play pieces beyond the standard canon and present new creators to the world. Some of these same organizations are known for premiering works that have rocked the cultural landscape, including the unobtrusively unusual 4 minutes and 33 seconds. 433 is programmed side by side with Mozart, Beethoven, and many more. Cage's works show that classical music canon can include not only the war horses of old, like a Mahler symphony or Vivaldi's Four Seasons, but works that further challenge the notion of what music is. This might be a nice place for a digression about the culture world and how it functions alongside the world of capitalism, and how Cage's works might have only been legitimized because of his middle-class upbringing and ability to pursue a private liberal arts education and world travel during the Great Depression of the 1930s, but we'll leave that aside. Cage was dedicated to ideas about music that ran far afield of what your typical concert goer expects from the listening experience. In fact, his works and other avant-garde compositions are performed in live, nationally televised, and likely expensive concerts, such as this concert at the Barbican Music Centre in London. Bringing these unique creations of musical history forward into our time has defied expectation. By definition, anything avant-garde tends to rub against any part of the established culture, and yet it still made this program. And look at the crowd, a full house. I bet they're familiar with this work, too. The musicians on the stage look just as serious as they would for any other composition. Even the conductor takes his time to prepare and then begin. But, oh, a little joke, and everyone's laughing. Probably because he must be so exhausted from holding that little stick up so high for so long. But in all seriousness, we're watching the last shreds of the validity being stripped out of a work of art with laughter. Now, I'm sure there will be a few who will watch this and say, it's silly, the piece is a joke, geez, it's probably not even music, and I'll say, you might be right. As you would expect when discussing any topic, music philosophers have to use examples of actual pieces of music, both composed and performed, in order for any argument they might make to hold water. If it doesn't apply to something in the real world, it doesn't apply to how we describe the real world. So you have to use something real. And 4 minutes and 33 seconds is real, and it gets used a lot. On Google Scholar, a search for Cage 4 minutes and 33 seconds reveals over 27,000 articles and citations. It's used as an example of art as music that doesn't contain any organized sounds. That wording is important because a lot of philosophers agree that music is organized sound. According to Andrew Kania in his article on music philosophy in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, explications of the concept of music usually begin with the idea that music is organized sound. It kind of falls apart from there, but we won't get into that. Let's get back to this organized sound idea. Organized sounds can be like this. And this is disorganized sounds. Organized sound disorganized. Disorganized. And organized again. While music is truly a global invention of mankind, spanning its many ages, music that evolved out of the European traditions of the medieval period and developed by the bourgeois class of the modern age is what we call classical music, and for millennia relied on organized sound. Cage wrote 4 minutes and 33 seconds within the Western classical music tradition, which was undergoing transformation via postmodernism, like many parts of culture in the early 20th century. During this time, magnetic tape was invented, allowing a composer to sample music for the first time in a recorded format. Cage gave a talk in 1937, bracketing the bulk of his address with a more overarching statement. Quote, "I believe that the use of noise to make music will continue and increase until we reach a music produced through the aid of electrical instruments which will make available for musical purposes any and all sounds that can be heard. Photoelectric, film, and mechanical mediums for the synthetic production of music will be explored. Whereas in the past, the point of disagreement has been between dissonance and consonance, it will be, in the immediate future, between noise and so-called musical sounds. New methods will be discovered," unquote. The invention of magnetic tape and later digital recording has allowed us to rearrange sounds in many ways impossible for the human body to create, and sometimes actually even understand. But as we try to understand 433, we have a couple of paths we can walk down. The first calls for a deeper understanding of John Cage's philosophy, his ethics of music, his compositional processes, and his appreciation of Zen Buddhism. The Western world has developed a notion of what it means to be present in the moment, the stillness that is associated with meditation. We can imagine that Cage intended this sort of stillness of mind and body, but can anyone achieve that state outside of the religious and cultural context of Zen Buddhism? To this, Cage says, quote, "What I do not wish blamed on Zen, though without my engagement with Zen, I doubt whether I would have done what I have done," unquote. Cage's compositional process was one of removal, and 433 was inevitable. In a good number of his works, he diverted from the way instruments are typically played, altered the mode of notation, even removed instruments from the work altogether. In Imaginary Landscape No. 3, he used radios. In Atlas Eclipticalis, he constructed his compositional framework using the I Ching, a traditional Chinese divination tool. In his Sonata No. 3, he devised a method of showing duration of sound spatially rather than symbolically. And in 433, he removed the performers, notation, instruments, everything but the listener, handing over the entire experience of the piece to the listening body. The performers, the audience, everyone is now just a listener. And what we commonly call music contains silence. Even just the beginning or end of a song is denoted by silence. The music comes from somewhere, it goes somewhere, temporally, spatially. Philosophers agree that Cage's intention was not to have people experience silence, but to allow any manner of sound to be included in the listening. A chair squeaks, a door shuts, the AC system in the recital hall kicks on, a cough, a sigh, a blink, every collective heartbeat was now the core of sound in the composition, and it would always be different, yet the same. Every part of 433 would depend on who was in the space listening, be it a concert hall or recording booth. Some argue that these seemingly random and very human sounds are what is intended in 433. But Cage himself disagrees. He argues that the listener shouldn't be trying to hear silence. No one should be trying to hear anything. They should just be listening. Listening to what? Doesn't matter, Cage says. Just listen. Cage explains in his book Silence that in some of his compositions, because they were composed with elements of indeterminacy, the mind itself became useless. If there is nothing to predict, no options to choose between, no symbols to interpret, then the mind can lay itself open while the music is produced. It's here that listening can occur unimpeded. Cage goes further. He says that silence is impossible. In multiple writings and lectures, he refers to an experience where he went into an anechoic chamber, or a soundproof booth, to experience the most intense quiet he could find. But he could still hear sounds, one high, one low. The engineer operating the booth told him that the high sound was his buzzing nervous system, and the low sound was the pulse of his blood rushing through his circulatory system. Cage's recollections of this experience occur even before humans had experienced the vacuum of space, and if a human could perceive the sound of space without a spacesuit, they would still hear the operations of their own body, triggering the tympanic membrane and signaling the mind that sound had happened. There is sound, as long as a person can perceive sound, and maybe if they can't, sounds exist. So even the common interpretation of what 433 is supposed to include is a flawed idea. Cage wasn't alone in challenging our ideas of how the constituent parts of music fit together. Not only were artists in his time trying to introduce entire new categories of expression into art, some were denying the foundation of what makes art in the first place. Marcel Duchamp sparked much discussion on what counts as art with his work Fountain in 1917, which features a toilet. And his series of works called Ready-Mades were an attempt to remove any feeling, any response at all from the viewing of art. Dick Higgins wrote a series of works called Danger Music, intended to bring feelings of fear, discomfort, and confusion to the listener. This philosophical evolution of music composition was revolutionary at the time, but now it directly conflicts with the second way of understanding this work, which is through the eyes of someone looking back on a flattened landscape of history. When it's first introduced to music classes, students roll their eyes and scoff that it's just silence, and claiming it might not be music. 433, along with many aleatoric or chance music pieces, get lumped together with first-year composition projects that are just poorly made. In fact, 433 isn't even the first piece to include no organized sounds. In 1897, humorist Alphonse Allais wrote, "Funeral March for the Obsequies of a Deaf Man," possibly deflating Cage's intentions half a century before he could express them. It could be said that postmodernism reduced the value of art by stripping away any talent or skill needed to become a creator. But most people that have heard or performed 433 likely don't know Cage's philosophy. The work is made less serious by stripping away its context over time, leaving a depth of knowledge of the artist's intention akin to mere gossip, honestly recounted but unverified and definitely not nuanced. Remember our conductor's joke, the audience laughing? Once we have taken Cage out of his context of the postmodern movement, out of the avant-garde music scene, his works seem more trivial, less rooted in any sort of philosophical framework. Audiences listening to 433 for the first time might be confused, and the muttering and clamor of a confused audience might suddenly become the sound that everyone is hearing. But Cage points out, as far back as its premiere, this is missing the point. Here's another audience attending a special performance in a private studio. While there might be more sincerity in their appreciation of this piece, it could be argued that knowing the substance of the work makes it predictable, which gives the mind something to consider as it's listening, thus defeating Cage's compositional mission. Listening never truly begins, the mind stays active, and the work is destroyed. Given how distorted Cage's intentions are by each subsequent listening of the work, we are left wondering if the original composition has ever been performed as intended, and if not, does the work even exist? The downside of viewing art outside of its philosophical context means that it can be reduced to something silly or profane. In fact, this can be enough to strip it of even its ability to have substance. If you see Duchamp's Fountain out on the street, you're probably just going to assume that someone left a toilet on the street. And it would be unreasonable to expect someone to see this piece outside of an art gallery and take it for a work of art. 433 is so contingent on its context that, unless officially programmed and staged in the context of more easily validated forms of music, it would look like a lot of folks just sitting around. So can 433 retain its significance this far removed from the composer or from its time period? Is it possible that outside of its native context, even after the substance of the work is flattened down by time and memory, we could find some validity and depth to this work? Perhaps only a little. We must consider our relationship to music as well. What habits have we developed in our own listening? What makes up our own definitions of music? How has music and culture changed in the last 70 years to inhibit or enhance our ability to understand Cage's original intentions? That if we take a moment and just listen to the world as it is, we can find music in that too.
People expect listening to be more than listening. And so sometimes they speak of inner listening, or the meaning of sound. When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner, but is just outer. And they say, these people who understand that finally say, you mean it's just sounds? Thinking that for something to just be a sound is to be useless. Whereas I love sounds just as they are.